have an all-star panel on Latin America. I'm a Latin Americanist, and they allowed me to put together a panel on Latin America in my first year as a member of the committee in the Royce Symposium. So thank you for that. The panel is titled Between the Eagle and the Dragon, Contemporary Latin America's Relations with the United States and China. And just a few words about what's going on in this panel. Relationship between Latin America and the United States and China has undergone significant transformations, as, I mean, we were here before, so we know. And the United States was a long dominant economic and political player in the region. China has been expanding its footprint, and that has altered the geopolitical landscape substantially. While Latin American countries navigate these dynamics, they must balance challenges, opportunities, try to deepen ties, who knows. The discussion is taking place in a time of, I don't know, that time is great, right? You know, there's no uncertainty, there's nothing going on in the world, right? No, we believe it's a timely occasion to talk about Latin America. The stakes are very high. This is America's backyard, as I learned back in the day when I was in Brazil, learning about the US as a foreign power, right? There's discussions about economic growth, political autonomy, regional stability, and today we'll explore some of these issues with pretty much the people who wrote the books on these issues. So it's just an amazing treat to have them join us. So let me introduce you to our panelists. We'll start with Dr. Gregory Weeks. He's the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He's a professor of political science and Latin American studies at that institution. His research focuses on Latin America, US-Latin American relations. He's published extensively on these topics. His most recent book, which we all have here, Embracing Autonomy, Latin America-US Relations in the 21st Century. And his other books include The Military and Politics in Post-Authoritarian Chile, which is amazing, and US and Latin America Relations, which now is in its third edition, Understanding Latin American Politics and the Irresistible Forces, Latin American Migration to the United States and its Effects in the South. Now, our second panelist will be Dr. Carol Wise. She's a professor of political science and international affairs at USC, University of Southern California. She has written widely and extensively on trade integration, exchange rates, institutional reform, political economy of market restructuring in Latin America. She's the author of Dragonomics, How Latin America is Maximizing or Missing Out on China's International Development Strategy, published in 2020. She's also the co-editor of Unexpected Outcomes, How the Emerging Economies Survived the 2008-2009 Global Financial Crisis, and co-editor of The Political Economy of China-Latin America Relations in the New Millennium, among other publications. And finally, we have Mr. Eric Farnsworth. He's the Vice President of the Council of the Americas in the Americas Society in Washington, D.C. He has a passion for promoting the importance of the Western Hemisphere for U.S. economic, security, and strategic interests. He has led the Washington office of the Council of the Americas since 2003. He maintains an important thought leadership and advocacy role across broad range of issues affecting the Western Hemisphere, including U.S. relations, economic development, trade, energy, Asia-Latin America relations, governance issues, security, democracy, the whole shebang. He began his career in Washington with the U.S. Department of State. He worked with Western Hemispheric Affairs And he also worked at the U.S. Trade Representative, which culminated in a 3-year appointment as a senior advisor to the White House Special Envoy for the Americas. Among other positions, he also worked in the Global Policy Division of Bristol-Myers Squibb and in the U.S. Senate with Senator Sam Nunn and at the U.S. House of Representatives with John Edward Porter. He's been decorated by many governments, including Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Spain. Yay, Brazil. All right, so let's start with Dr. Weeks. Please, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you to Owen for inviting me and Igor for doing this. It's really a pleasure to be here. And there's no better place to be talking about China, certainly, than in the Nixon Museum. What I'm going to do is provide some context for the role of China in Latin America. And I'm going to do that through the lens of autonomy. And autonomy is a concept that came out of the Latin American scholarly literature. And it's getting more attention now, I think, but it was largely ignored by US scholars. And the idea in autonomy is just, especially we're talking about, at least for this discussion, on foreign policy decisions, but it can also be domestic, but the ability to make policy decisions with outside interference. This was particularly relevant for Latin America because of the role of the US. So throughout US-Latin American relations, the history of US-Latin American relations, Latin American autonomy was quite limited, especially after the US industrialized and really turned its attention toward the region. We had the Monroe Doctrine, but it didn't really have teeth for a while. And there's variation. Smaller, more economically dependent countries closer to the US had even less autonomy. Those that were larger, more diverse. Further away had more, but there were limitations. And frankly, there weren't a whole lot of alternatives to the United States. Europe had pulled out in large measure. England had been very involved in places like Central America, but by the time you get to the 20th century, the US is really quite dominant. We have the exception later in the Cold War with Cuba and the Soviet Union, but that's still exceptional. So the Soviet Union was much less around the region than you might expect given the context of the Cold War. Further, and really up until the 1980s, the US appetite for covert operations and invasion was still pretty high. So there were costs to making decisions that the US didn't like, and Latin American countries were well aware of that. So when we get to the 1990s, so I've just given you an entire history of 150 years in like 45 seconds, but that's what, if you have to do this in 15 minutes, that's the price that we pay. But by the time we get to the 90s, obviously the US emphasis on security has been very clear. The Cold War was clearly, it was ideological, and security, particularly from Soviet Union, from communism in general, was paramount. But democracy promotion did start to increase, US interest in democracy promotion, and for our purposes, even more importantly, a focus on economic liberalization. So to really push Latin American countries to develop export-led market economies, and that push by the US, which kind of culminated in the free trade area of the Americas, an idea from the 90s and early 2000s that ended up not working, but the idea was that the US would be the prime beneficiary of these economic models. Because we're together in the hemisphere, the FTAA was supposed to be this, it would all be together with this sort of block. But that's not what happened. And Instead, we see changes that perhaps were not anticipated. And so to explain the rise of Chinese influence in Latin America is really explaining the rise of many other extra-hemispheric actors, because the European Union is also very active in Latin America. But there's similar reasons. So the first reason is that the end of the Cold War ended the ideological limitations to what the US was going to accept. So it opened a door for countries that might not be allies of the United States to engage more with Latin America without backlash. And that would eventually include China. Second is the US insistence really on a economic or a export-led model. And so that had spread across Latin America. And then what happened is that Latin America started to look for partners increasingly outside of the Western Hemisphere. And in many ways, the US had, wittingly or not, encouraged them to do that. They started doing that precisely as China started to open up, become more interested around the world. We've heard a lot about Africa. I don't know anything about the Chinese influence in Africa, but I would suspect it could be quite similar to what we see in Latin America. And Latin America, just as it has been for the US for many years, China saw Latin America as an important place for primary products. So we've heard throughout the day quite a bit of that as well. So these things by the 1990s were all coming together. And so the book that was mentioned focuses on the 21st century. And so when we get to the 21st century, it's really remarkable. We're at a remarkable time for US-Latin American relations, of change that, by the way, is unrelated to the current administration, but really rapid and sometimes surprising change. In the 2000s, what I would argue, and I'll be arguing, I'll say, we were distracted by the idea of the quote-unquote pink tide. So the pink tide was a reference to the growth of leftist governments in Latin America, spearheaded by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, but then later Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, I mean, countless others. Pink because they weren't communist, but they were socialist or socialist leaning. And what we are, and I'm going to say we because it's me. So if you've been in academia long enough or studying something long enough, you start arguing against what you believed 20 years ago, or you say how you were wrong, or at least hopefully, because all of us are wrong sometimes. But we were distracted by this. What Hugo Chavez was saying is that, well, we're going to have this counterweight to the United States and Latin America. It's going to be anti-capitalist. It's going to be social, whatever 21st century socialism, which was Chavez's thing that nobody can really define, but it was all going to be anti-US. And it was going to be driven with Latin American unity. And so there was a lot of attention to this. A lot. Are we seeing this? Are we seeing a sea change in Latin America? What are we seeing? And in fact, Chavez was wrong. The important thing going on actually was not socialism. And the important thing going on was definitely not Latin American unity, which has never happened and for the foreseeable future isn't going to happen. What was important was that Latin America was able to play the field. That all countries, if you go back and look since 2000, all countries in Latin America, it didn't matter what their ideology was, it didn't matter whether they were friends, adversaries, or whatever of the US, they were looking outside the hemisphere, and they were virtually all also looking at China. That was the model, the economic model, honestly, that the US had been proposing for decades. Chile, for example, was a close ally, and Chile had been pursuing free trade agreements by the dozens over the years, and other countries really started to follow suit. China was irrelevant to Latin America, and certainly irrelevant to the U.S.-Latin American relations for the vast majority of its history since Latin American independence. But it increased quickly. We've been hearing about that in various ways throughout the day today as well. So that we see increased, so what I wrote in the book was that initially tentative relationship with China would strengthen, heads of state would visit each other, business leaders would do so more often, and they would sign agreements focused largely on the raw materials China saw as essential for economic growth. So this was increasing significantly throughout, now for the past 25 years. And so I would suggest that taking ideology out of it makes it more clear that changes were happening, and the fact that these changes are now so deep is that they're very hard to undo. And if you're wondering, by the way, if I'm going to be able to say, like, what should the U.S. do, I'm not. There's perhaps a lot of things, there have been a lot of ideas thrown out over the course of the day. I don't have great ideas, in part because when if you're dealing with something that's been in place for a very long time, then it's not easy, especially when there's deeply embedded economic ties. All right, so we have all of Latin America eager for foreign investment. We have multiplication of trade and investment partners across Latin America. And as I said, and China is deeply embedded. So the fact is that Latin America is more autonomous now than it's ever been. And by that specifically, I mean that the U.S. has been so dominant in Latin America that it's jarring to come to the realization that the U.S. is still hegemonic. We're still the most powerful country in the hemisphere. And as we've seen even with President Trump's, the question of, say, Panama, there's still a lot of power the U.S. exerts, a lot. But things are different. It's not 1990, it's certainly not 1960. And with regard to what does this then mean? And the fact is that what I've just been saying, all of it is irrespective of the Trump administration or any U.S. president in particular. These are things that have been going on for decades. But specifically now, with the Trump administration, there's kind of a nature abhors a vacuum kind of situation. And so Latin America, more than at any other point in its history, is able to pivot. Yes, do threats from the U.S. matter? Do tariffs? Absolutely they do. It's not to say that that any Latin American country can ignore the U.S. because they can't. We saw that even with Colombia not too long ago. But it is true also is that if the U.S. imposes tariffs on China, U.S. imposes tariffs on Latin America, then it's quite likely that the relationship between Latin America and China will get stronger because they will sell to each other. As the U.S. reduces foreign aid, there are other sources of foreign aid, even if less reliable. And I say that somebody had used the example of, say, masks. It was true, too, that China had tried to provide, or did provide some assistance, vaccines, for example, to Latin America, but they were seen as less reliable. So, I mean, I want to say throughout this, too, is that very often, Latin America would prefer to have the U.S. as a strong, reliable partner. But if at any point the U.S. is not seen as a strong, reliable partner, then there will be shifts. And again, this isn't only to China. So this does mean the European Union, it does mean Canada, it does mean other countries. Now, lastly, there's the cost of alienation. If in an uncertain atmosphere, China will be seen as more stable. Latin America does not prefer China. I think we've heard ample, examples of that. It's not really a preference thing. Latin America does value being able to have multiple partners so that it's not dependent on anyone at any given time. So it's very important for the U.S. to continue to be seen as a stable partner. But, you know, that's tricky right now. If the U.S. is not seen as a stable partner, China's soft power will grow. Soft power has been very gradual. And, you know, the U.S. and Latin America have a long shared history, linguistically, you know, so Chinese is much more difficult to learn. It's like there's so many connections, natural connections, cultural connections, migratory connections between Latin America and the U.S. that, you know, Chinese soft power isn't, you know, necessarily exploding. But China now has more diplomatic posts around the world than any other country. And there's a wide variety of means by which China exerts soft power. Further, from a symbolic standpoint, the U.S. has been making the argument that China is out for self-interest, only self-interest, and therefore Latin America should really be looking at the U.S. It's tough if the U.S. starts saying outright, we're only looking for our self-interest. So that really, it pulls some of the moral authority out of it. And lastly, so the very last point, as I got the time card coming down my way. No, it's good. It's good. It stops people from running over. But China has zero interest in democracy. If anything, it's antithetical to democracy. So the U.S. should not squander any opportunity to be able to be seen as the partner, to be seen as a model, and to be viewed as a model of democracy, you know, because the consequences are pretty significant. And so with that, I will finish, and we'll look forward to Q&A.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wise, you have the floor.
Thank you. This is on? Yes. Yeah, it's on. Okay, I'm so delighted to be here. I just live 40 miles away, according to Google Maps, and I've never been here. It's pretty bad. USC is very close, and shame on me. No, you get stuck in your silo, right? So let me flesh out some of the things, add some more, if you will, details to Greg's presentation. What I want to do is start out by saying the U.S. has a very long relationship with Latin America, including the backyard and Monroe Doctrine and whatnot. And one of China's advantages here is that it doesn't have any baggage with Latin America, really. There was a time, believe it or not, during the end of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, which a great famine broke out due to drought and very, very badly planned policies. Who sold China wheat and grain in the throes of this crisis? Mexico and Argentina. And this was in 1962. And they had no real relationship with China, but they found each other in the international market. They made the Chinese pay in hard currency, i.e. dollars. I don't know where the Chinese got the hard currency, but they did. So there's all kinds of, you know, little facts about that. And I would say up until the beginning of the Chinese major reform period in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, the relationship between Latin America and China was thin, kind of flimsy. But at the beginning of the 80s and 90s, Deng Xiaoping began supporting Latin America. For example, I think you've written a lot on the Central American peace process. Yes. Taking a stand on issues that were considered third worldist, or at that time, it was the Group of 77, right? And so that morphed later on into a relationship that we see today, which I'm going to focus on the 21st century because, quite frankly, China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and it burst onto the international market. It completely changed international trade to the chagrin of Western economists that said that China would enter these markets at the lowest level, and all of our workers got to climb up, and and well, you know, all of our workers are displaced, and we're living in an industrial wasteland, right? But the big burst in China-Latin America relations comes after China enters the World Trade Organization, and this is basically China's relationship with the world, like it or not. A lot of countries are trading with China at a deficit, including many in Central America and Mexico. So let me distinguish that the north of the region, that is to say Central America, Mexico, have been trading at a very big disadvantage with China. They're carrying big trade deficits with China. Why? Because they don't have any of these valuable natural resources that our last panel was emphasizing. They don't have that much to offer, right? Mexico, interestingly, has gone up and dug up a new lithium mine and, you know, taken a copper mine that had been turned into a tourist attraction, and now they're you know, like excavating copper and other minerals because that's what China wants. The big bucks and the big relationship is in what we would call the Southern Cone, and that's Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and then Peru, which is up from the Southern Cone. Those are the big relationships. And not surprisingly, this is where the big mineral deposits are. And in the case of Argentina and Brazil, major soybean production. I think they've, because of the US trade war on China that began in 2018, the agricultural belt in the US has taken a big hit. The soybean producers in the US, which were very competitive, are basically out of business, right? I have my ideas how that could have been avoided, but let's move forward, right? So beginning with our baseline in the 21st century, and I've studied Latin America for 35 years. I'm new to China. I'm not a sinologist, but I've been there a lot, and I studied it a lot. I haven't learned any Mandarin, right, but I've studied it. So let's look at the way the Chinese have entered into Latin America. Yes, they're predatory. Yes, they will rob you blind if you let them. Its first two countries were Ecuador and Venezuela. Now, the Chinese have always prided themselves on no conditionality with lending, none. This is changing because those two countries are now holding China in a debt trap. But it started there, and it started with the obvious oil wealth and mineral wealth in those two countries. And this is when Hugo Chavez was still alive. So it's like 2006, 2007. And so there was sort of some ideological affinity, but the Chinese right now don't really want to do that. They want to do economic business and soft power diplomacy. Politics, they don't want to do, right? They don't want to talk about, you know, ideology, excuse me, with Venezuela. Okay, so long story short, the non-conditional loans led to billions of dollars in lending going to the Ecuadorian and the Venezuelan governments. And, you know, there's bullet train in Venezuela that's half done. And now these are starting to look like, you know, urban ruins. All these different dams in Ecuador. And most of that money was channeled through the office of the president, always a bad idea in Latin America, always, right? And boom, you can't really track the funds. And China, now this is interesting, they're dealing with a different kettle of fish in these two countries. If it were like a highly rated country by Moody's and all the different, risk assessments and whatnot, they would probably go in with some thunder and try to get that money, but they're not. I mean, these countries are pretty tanked. So what they do is they actually, against their own beliefs, went to the International Monetary Fund and said, We want to do a loan restructuring, but we need you to come. And this is brand new, right? Because these, there's always been some animosity between these Western institutions and Chinese institutions. So anyway, what they did in Ecuador and Venezuela is stretched out the loan, reduced maybe $400 million in interest payments. I mean, they took some losses that they knew they were going to take. And these two countries, with the IMF involved, but no policy reforms to speak of, but kind of the watchdog, these loans are being paid very slowly. So the predatory nature of Chinese business and dealings, sometimes it gets averted. So when you see them going in and they want to do these hydroelectric dams in Patagonia and Argentina, right? If the Argentine government doesn't stand up to them, which it didn't, just let it rip, right? Very bad projects, very bad. But they also wanted to go in and do a complete remodeling of the Brazilian electric grid, which was a mess. The Brazilians are a highly ranked country in terms of risk. They have mature capital markets. They are, I believe, like the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world economy. I mean, they have tons of problems and cyclical crises, but they're serious actors. So the Chinese went in there, and Brazil demands competitive bidding on tenders. They demand labor upholding, it's very unionized in Brazil, right? Upholding of labor norms, respect for workers. And they told the Chinese that they could bring in 15% of parts and labor, the whole thing. Whereas in Argentina, it was 80%, because the Argentines said, we just want the money. The secret with we just want the money is that lots of times the money doesn't even leave Shanghai or Beijing. It's in the China Development Bank or the China Export-Import Bank or any number of state-owned enterprises. The funds go straight to the contractors, especially if it's dominant Chinese. And the local host, as you would call it, doesn't really get a lot of slush funds. So there was, I think, a lot of, naivety, especially on the part of the Argentines about what they're going to get out of this. They got a big debt, is what they got, like a $30 billion debt. But Peru, Chile, and Brazil, Chile and Peru have free trade agreements with the U.S. And if you negotiate a free trade agreement with the U.S., it's like you've opened your services, you've opened your trade, you're offering national treatment to foreign investors. It's pretty much the U.S. business blueprint, which is a pretty good blueprint, right? So China came to them and wanted to negotiate a free trade agreement, and they were like, what? But the Chinese agreed to do all of this. Now, they did services and investment later, but the first thing was mutual reductions on, most favored nation, mutual reductions on tariffs. So, because of joining the U.S. free trade agreement, two separate agreements, one with Chile, one with Peru, they were already up to speed on all these things that doing business indicators at the World Bank are, always, advising, which is rule of law, respect for private property, transparency. Now, it's not perfect, okay, but they're basically, if you look at some of the indicators, they're doing pretty well. Brazil does well without that, although it has pockets where they will do competitive bidding, they will hold the Chinese feet to the fire. Argentina, forget it. So the Chinese really kicked off a gigantic commodity boom, which some of you may have felt, which was from 2003 to 2013. And if you look at the index beginning in 2002 on soybeans, copper, iron ore, certainly oil, natural gas, fish meal of all things, because the Chinese are building a livestock industry and they give them fish meal, right? So if you look at that, these went off the chart. So you had really historic, it's the biggest commodity price boom we've seen to date in the modern era, which I date around the Industrial Revolution in England, okay, 17th, 18th century. So big commodity boom. So times were good, as a former professor of mine used to say. I did political science, development economics, and international relations, so times were good. Now, in the meantime, to hold this relationship together, I mean, China wants the investment, and it wants whatever it can get in terms of resources. So in order to hold this all together, the Chinese did something very smart. And they they developed, if you will, a diplomatic strategy toward Latin America. And by the way, this is the same diplomatic strategy that they have developed toward Africa. And even though it's soft power, it's flimsy, it is the symbolic nature of this. For example, China wrote, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did 2 white papers on China-Latin America relations, one in 2008, one in 2016. They hosted, and then Chile hosted, and they're going back again, these huge summits with all of Latin America, including the authoritarian states, all right? They don't distinguish, but with all of Latin America. And it's, strategic partnerships, language exchanges, all of this. And as Greg is saying, the relationship with China and Latin America, or US and Latin America, it hasn't been very diplomatic, right? You're not seeing the same kind of reaching out. The Chinese joined as many Western hemispheric institutions as they could, the Caribbean Development Bank, the Organization of American States, the Inter-American, they created 2 Inter-American funds in the Inter-American Development Bank. One is for equity. In other words, China is putting up equity capital for private investors and entrepreneurs in Latin America. And the other is a platform for credit for industrial projects, right? So these things are what's filling in the spaces and really, solidifying a relationship that has been absent, I don't know if it was ever to this extent, between the US and Latin America. I'm getting my 3-minute warning. So I've got, this is a 45-minute PowerPoint that I made to the Southern Military Command in Panama last summer. And I looked out, and they actually were engaged. They're all in different uniforms, generals, colonels, so anyway, I'm squishing it down. And let me finish, because we're going to do some Q&A here after Eric's presentation. But let me just say that goodwill, polite manners, diplomatic gestures like white papers and conferences, in the 2018 summit between Latin American countries and China, they invited Latin America into the so-called Belt and Road, an aggressive lending program for infrastructure projects. It's not free money. We've made that clear here, right? And there's been very few Belt and Road investments in Latin America because COVID hit. China, as we've been talking about, the economy is soft, and there's been very little lending from that. But I want to finish by saying something. We have different views among us in this room. I don't agree with some people here, and you probably aren't going to agree with me, but I think there is an alternative to Marco Rubio, our new Secretary of State, going to Panama and threatening them. The fact is that China does not own the Panama Canal. Fake news. It owns about 20%, and notice that when Rubio left, suddenly BlackRock comes in and buys out Hutchinson to 80% of Hutchinson, which are they manage 2 ports at the Panama Canal. So whoopee, we pushed China out ostensibly, although it's still one of the top ships that go through. They had to widen it and because of these huge container ships. I think that's very counterproductive. I think that, it was the Trump trade team, if that's what you want to call it, that insisted on renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement in 2018. And the two partners, Canada and Mexico, said, I guess so. And that is the first agreement that the U.S. has negotiated that results in more protectionism than free trade. And I think the first steps about these tariffs, don't get me started, but to leverage tariffs against our two partners in a free trade agreement, what is that? That's very bad faith, and especially on the Canadian side. The Mexican side, okay, that big stick, it did get the cartels, under control for how long, I don't know, and it emptied out the border for I don't know how long. But where do we go from there, right? More tariffs? And I can mention some other things, but I'll stop there, and I think they could take a page from China in terms of some diplomacy, some respect. You don't need to go down there and threaten countries to get your way based on facts that are non-existent. That's my line.
Mr. Farnsworth, you have the floor. Thank you, Dr.
I don't know if I want it at this point. Thank you, Igor, I think. This has been, no, I'm teasing. It's great. You guys are going to miss this great presentation. You're leaving. This is the highlight of the evening, so I'm sure you do. Sure you do.
Okay.
Yeah, Thursday afternoon class, right? When was the last time that actually happened? That's a class, right? But anyway.
At 3:30.
Exactly. No, I'm just, I need to be better behaved. I really want to thank the organizers. Look, I've known Ed Royce for a long time, but it's Marie who I actually met first. I don't know where Marie is. There you are. When she was in the private sector with Alcatel-Lucent, and we engaged on all kinds of technology issues, and then she became very famous and powerful at the State Department, and Ed was actually the trailing spouse, in my view. And so it was great to have, but to be with both of you, it really is a privilege and a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. And I do have to shout out Leah Campos, who used to work with Ed as a staffer on the Foreign Relations Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee. She is now our nominee to the Dominican Republic. She's a personal friend of mine, and it was through her that this invitation actually came to me. So she's not here, but I will take her name in vain and thank her for her facilitating that invitation. It's also a privilege, of course, to be at the Nixon Library. I don't live 40 miles from the library. I live in Washington, D.C., but like Carol, I'm not the best proponent of my home city. I've never been to the top of the Washington Monument, and that's 5 miles from where I live. So you get a special dispensation, I think, but it is good to be at the Nixon Library. And I will endeavor to keep my comments short enough so that I do not get the hand signal that says I have to stop, or else on penalty of my mic being cut off. You've heard a lot already. I'm not going to go into the background of U.S.-Latin American relations or how we got here. I think all of that's been trod over very, very well by my two predecessors who've done a magnificent job, as they always do. I want to start with a snapshot of 3 trips that I took to Peru. One in 2008, one in 2016, and one in 2024. And the purpose of each was for the APEC meeting. APEC is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. There should be another word there, organization, but there isn't. But anyway, APEC is a grouping of countries, primarily in the Asia-Pacific region, hence Asia-Pacific, but it also includes North America, and it includes several countries in South America and in Latin America. So you've got Peru, Chile, and Mexico are members of APEC, and of course the United States and Canada. Peru has hosted the meetings. It's a leaders' meeting, presidents and prime ministers and leaders of countries. They've hosted the meeting 3 times in the years that I said. I've been there all 3 times. And I think it's provided a really interesting snapshot about China's activities in the Americas. Because remember, China's a member of APEC, right? So the leader of China comes to the meetings, generally, not in San Francisco, but generally, as a show of engagement and support and what have you. In 2008, remember, we had just come out of we were in the midst of, yes, thank you, a global economic crisis. China's leader was in Peru, but he was of not any particular consequence, right? I mean, he was one of a number of leaders. George Bush had just been, it was after the US election, so he was a lame duck, he was leaving. Obama had been elected but not inaugurated yet. And so but the focus of the meeting was really on the United States. And how was the United States going to be working with the developed nations to really bring the global economy out of a really serious recession, a scary recession, for those of you who remember, it's only 15 years ago. But the opportunity was, how is the US going to help us out of this? China was there, but it wasn't a major player in my recollection. The other, there was a big Peru thing there too, but let's keep it in the China lane. The second APEC meeting in Peru was in 2016. Now, you remember what happened in 2016. This was also November. It was after the US elections, but before the inauguration. So Donald Trump had been elected, but not yet inaugurated. This was the meeting that Xi Jinping came to. He brought with him a delegation of 500 Chinese business people. He declared himself to be the protector of free trade in the Asia-Pacific region. Think about this. The largest communist country in history is now going to be the protector of free trade in the Asia-Pacific, which has traditionally, or at least since the end of World War II, been a US protectorate, essentially, along with our allies, Japan, Australia, et cetera. But the focus was shifting from the United States saying, we are going to come back into the United States. We're going to withdraw from some global commitments. And at the time of the APEC meetings, President Obama was there, by the way. He was, but he had no particular profile. At the time of the APEC meetings, that was when President-elect Trump decided that would be the best time to say the United States, as one of the first acts when he comes into the White House, would be to withdraw from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, the TPP was not specifically a China issue. It was not, China's not a party to it. It really derived from other avenues, et cetera. But it had become sort of a shorthanded way to talk about US engagement economically in the Asia-Pacific region. And the subtext there, the nuance was, as a counterweight to China. Right? So to say during the APEC meetings, as the leader of China was there, planting the flag for free markets in the Western Hemisphere, that the US president-elect was saying the United States is pulling out of the economic bulwark for the Asia-Pacific that had been implicitly designed to contain China, was a monumental shift in global politics. Again, that was that you could feel it. You could feel in the air the shift that was happening. And for those who think I'm exaggerating, just a couple months later in Davos, and this would have been in 2017, Xi Jinping went there as well, and he declared that China henceforth would be the protector of global open markets, right? So the APEC speech was essentially the coming out party of that speech. It was the road testing the remarks, and then he used them in Davos, and that's what got all the news. Everybody else forgot about the APEC comments. At the time, that's what got the news. But China's presence in the region had been growing. There was a lot of talk about it, but it was a lot of, well, okay, but what does it really mean? Fast forward to this last November, 2024. Again, I was there. I had the privilege to address the Peruvian Congress. I did certain things. I was part of the CEO forum, et cetera, et cetera. So I was involved deeply in the aspects. The main news, think about it, it's only a couple months ago, if you remember, the main news coming out of the trip was not that Joe Biden was there, President Biden was there, but that China's leader, Xi Jinping, was opening up the Shanghai port. Shanghai port is a major Chinese investment on the coast of Peru, obviously, if it's a port, it's on the coast, that is going to, once it gets up to its full capacity, it is going to fundamentally remake the economic relationship between South America and China. Fundamentally. It's not a Peru-China thing, it's a South America-China thing. And as Carol was saying, I think quite rightly, the relationship with South America and China has been built over the years on commodities. We can go into that, I could bore you with all kinds of things, but the point is that this is the fundamental relationship that continues to drive China's economic interests in Latin America. China's not there for development of the region. China isn't there for goodwill. China isn't there because it has some vision of let's grow together. China's there because it wants what Latin America produces. And then on the investment side, China has a whole lot of hard currency from the United States buying Chinese products that the Chinese have to put to work somewhere. Otherwise, it sits in a vault somewhere in the Bank of China collecting dust. What are you going to do with this currency? Well, you deploy it. You send it overseas. You put it in emerging markets. You grow your interest in your economy. And with that economic engagement comes political leverage. And what Carol was talking about and Greg was talking about, I think, is absolutely right. You have debt profiles. You have economic engagement and dependence on markets. And that comes with political leverage to the extent that a country like a China can use that to promote their own political interests. I disagree slightly with the idea that there isn't a political agenda here. There's a massive political agenda here. And it's to promote China's worldview, ultimately, that goes well beyond buying commodities from Brazil. It goes to the point of China promoting itself as the guarantor of a global governance system that it believes does not serve its purpose in the post-war period, and in fact has tried to limit its ambitions, and China is actively using this engagement to try to promote itself at the minimum as a neutral party or an equal party with the global system that the United States created after World War II, and hopefully in Beijing's eyes as the superior model. And so that's why you hear a lot of this engagement on the political side about, well, the US really isn't that good to you. Europeans, they're exploitative. You know, and I could give you a lot of examples. I don't have time, but the point is that this, if you can delegitimize what's been there before and promote your own model as more efficient, more effective, fairer. Oh, by the way, we've got a lot of money for you. By the way, we're not going to ask you to do anything with it other than, you know, what you want to do with it and pay us back at some point. That's an attractive business model for a lot of people receiving money. And it's changing hearts and minds, and it's changing global dynamics. So I come back to this idea of Shanghai Port, right? So this is a major infrastructure development on the coast of South America. It will change the dynamics I mentioned, but people say, okay, well, United States, what are you going to do about it? Well, right now, there's nothing you can do about it. It's too late. The port's there. Right? And it's dual use. At some point, you're going to see the Chinese Blue Water Navy making port calls on South America for the first time in history. That will happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But the Chinese Navy is developing. They're developing infrastructure throughout the region. This is a possibility and a probability, in my view. But the point that I want to make and I want to emphasize is China wasn't the first, I won't say partner, but the first choice.
Imperialist.
No, they weren't the first choice. The Peruvians wanted U.S. investors to develop that port.
Yeah.
And the United States said, Peru? What do we care about Peru? Too far away. We got ports. There's no infrastructure to the port. It's too complicated. There's some corruption in Peru, et cetera, right? Chinese looked at it as a strategic investment in their global ambitions. Now, it came up in the other panel, it came up in this panel, it's absolutely correct. The Chinese model is different from the US model. Chinese government can direct its private sector where to go. We cannot. I frankly think that's an advantage of the US system, but it does mean we have to work harder. And it means we have a different view of emerging markets. These are now strategic. They are not throwaways, if they ever were, but they're not an afterthought. This is where the battle for global governance is being fought, and where the West, if we can call it the West anymore, is losing influence, engagement, opportunity. Look, China needs commodities. There's nothing wrong with China buying commodities. China needs a diplomatic relationship. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's not the first choice of most of emerging markets, I would argue. I'm getting it, so I better quit. So I failed in my one goal. Emerging markets want U.S. investment. They want Western investment. It's not the 1800s. You don't have Spanish galleons running around the Caribbean anymore. They're desperate for the investment that's not materialized. We can talk why it's not materializing. I come from the private sector. I work with the private sector, and there are valid reasons why U.S. or other companies would not invest in Honduras. But, just to pick a country. But the point is, if we want to compete, we have to do better. There are 4 very quick things I will mention, then perhaps we can develop them further in the question and answer. First is, we have to recognize what's at stake. This is a strategic issue. We have to recognize it's not just about trade. When China has leverage over countries, that means things like votes on Tibet, Taiwan, global human rights engagement, and domestic issues in China itself. And it also means calling into question the Western business model. There is a lot here that goes well beyond economics. Number 2, I think I think Marie's comments were absolutely spot on. We got to do better on the education front. It's not just bringing students to the United States, it's educating our friends in the Western Hemisphere. What is this China thing? What does it mean, right? It's not just buying commodities. It's trying to build a different relationship that will last for the longer term in a way that's going to, if you allow it, reform and change your own societies in a way you may find anti-democratic and you may find inconvenient. Number 3, I think we have to encourage a better look. We have our CFIUS process. For those of you who don't know, it's basically an investment screening process for international investment and for for national security reasons. If we find it inconvenient, the United States can reject foreign investment in certain projects or certain sectors. Most of Latin America doesn't have that type of process. So if you're a copper miner in Chile and China says, I want to come in, there's no national security screen as to whether that's a good investment or not, based on the broader issues, not just the money for developing a particular resource. And so I think that's something that we have to do better, working with our friends and allies. And the 4th thing, the last thing I would say, and I want to land on this specifically, we've got to use the tools better that we have. DFC has come up already several times, the Development Finance Corporation. Ed Royce is a champion of that. But I have to say, DFC has been perhaps good in Africa. It's been a disaster in Latin America, in part because most of the countries in Latin America are not eligible for DFC actions, because we wrote the legislation to exclude countries that are of a certain level of development. And Latin America is middle income. And so we say, because this is development, you're too rich for us, so we can't engage with it. So the first thing we have to do, we got to think about this differently. This isn't development assistance. This is strategic investment assistance. We had USAID. I was going to say have. We had USAID. We certainly had other development agencies. DFC needs to be a strategic investment vehicle to allow us to redevelop the port of Montevideo in Uruguay, as the Uruguayans are desperate for us to do, not to have the Chinese guys come in and do it and redevelop it the way they're going to do, because we can't allow ourselves the tools that we already have to be deployed in the Latin American space. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, a great idea. It still exists. What do? Nothing in Latin America, because again, the levels that we allow ourselves to work in, except for the most impoverished countries like El Salvador, Haiti, but that's not where the strategic investment is being made. It's being made in Peru, in the port of Chancay. It's being made in Montevideo, Uruguay. It's being made in Chile and Brazil. That's where the battle is coming from, hearts and minds, and that's where I think we have to engage. Sorry to go on a little bit long, but if you couldn't tell, I get a little bit passionate. And Igor, you made me wait until the end, so I had all this stuff built up, and I want to just kind of get it out there, right? So anyway, I hope I at least kept it lively for you all. Thanks for your attention. Exactly right. Thanks.
All right. Beautiful. Right. So thank you so much. I am going to be magnanimous and not ask my question and pass it to the audience for their questions.
Okay. Anybody? Question?
Well, you're leaving.
Have one.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Royce. We all know that many Latin American countries have competition with China in some industries like automobile, clothes, and maybe toys, furnitures. And we know that China always see this type of competition as an industrial war that it must win. I want to know, what do you think this can impact their relation?
I think that's a very good question. I'm an expert on Mexico. I've written books on it, and I think that it was the last vote that China needed to get into the World Trade Organization. Mexico held China hostage and insisted on huge tariffs on those products, all right? Like 100, I think it was 1,000 goods, tariffs for 8 years, okay? In order to give the Mexicans time to restructure. Then they come back to, to the Chinese, oh, we need 4 more years. So it's 12 years of very high tariffs and the agreement that China would not complain to the WTO for this. Okay, so the tariffs finally come down, and what do we have? No restructuring, no competition, it's just tariffs, right? And so Mexico, in my mind, really, blew the opportunity to seriously restructure their domestic industries. Part of it is their dependence on the U.S. economy under NAFTA, but the other part of it is just, what are you doing? Like, get a strategy. And very, very poorly managed policies during that time, and they're paying a heavy price.
Other questions? Igor, you may get your chance.
There we go. I'm happy to ask. I was hoping I wouldn't get to ask my Trump question, but hey, here we go. And a question goes for all 3 panelists. So I'm originally from Brazil, and I follow the country, follow security institutions, that's what I study. And I've been thinking a lot about what's gonna happen in the next administration when it comes to democracy promotion in Latin America.
You mean the Trump?
This one, yeah, the one that, yeah.
Yeah.
And the reason, there's all good reasons to think about this, but I have one concrete case where, concrete action from the previous administration may have saved my country from, a potential authoritarian.
You mean the Biden administration?
Yes. So Brazil we had our version of January 6th, right? But in Brazil it was January 8th.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and there was an insurrection. People took over the capital and everything else. And Brazil did not have a military coup, which is amazing, counting the history of the country, right? And why did that not happen? Scholars now are studying that throughout, between when President Lula won the election and when he took office, there were repeated communications and a trip by then Secretary of Defense General Lloyd Austin to Brazil to talk to the military brass of Brazil. And what was said there, reportedly, is we're not going to accept it. You should not do a coup like you did in '64, right? You should not support military intervention. And that may have saved, that may have prevented the military from joining the insurrection and toppling Brazil's, somewhat fragile democracy. I'm wondering down the road, right, in this administration, if we could expect something like that when another rising authoritarian, and it will happen, right? Rising authoritarians are, the house specialty of Latin America. Should we expect the same? Should we expect firm democracy, support for democracy in these countries? Thank you so much.
You want to go across, or?
Now let's, whoever wants to start first.
My colleagues are better experts on this than I am because I'm a political economist, development economics, but let me just say something. By coincidence, I just reviewed someone for tenure. They're going to get it, I hope, at USC, but they're writing on, they were writing on democracy promotion, and I learned a lot, which is that the definition of democracy, like sometimes they're using just the bare minimum. In countries and other places, it's a more kind of high-functioning matter. But democracy promotion, as I believe being practiced by some of the USAID programs and some of the National Endowment for Democracy programs, have not been successful. They haven't been successful. This is what I learned from all the data that I saw with this review. However, I've read other things, and they just haven't really paid off. Now, high-level intervention from the head of state paid off. I'm going to be honest. I don't see the current head of state of the United States giving a hoot about democracy anywhere, right? Including here. So I think you better I think Brazil better fasten its seatbelt and, buck up, because I don't think there's going to be any support for that. In fact, there'd be support more for these types like Bolsonaro and whatnot, the former thug that was president, right?
If I could, thank you, Igor. It's a great question, Carol, for your comments. I would just say in the China context a couple things. One is, notice when the chips are down, who has the relationship to be able to say, get back in your barracks. It wasn't the defense minister of China that showed up in Brasilia. It was the US Secretary of Defense. Same thing in Guatemala, you could argue, and this is, I think, going to continue to be the case. When it comes to issues like that, I don't see China engaging in the least, because ultimately, China doesn't care what kind of government is in a particular country in Latin America. They've proven that over the years about who they're willing to deal with and on what basis. Point number one. Point number two, if the issue really is of the United States to compete effectively with China for our own benefit, for America first, for our own economic well-being, et cetera, I would submit to you that the best way to do that is with our friends and allies working together in a coordinated way, specifically the North American production platform that was created by the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I was part of the negotiation team at USTR back in the early 1990s, has proven its worth dramatically. It was replaced, of course, by the USMCA, which is now called under question. But the idea that the best way to compete with China is for the United States to cast aside Canada and Mexico, to me, is just not sensical. Right? So the best way to compete with China economically is with the fully integrated production platforms that we have with Canada and Mexico, making all three of us more competitive. And frankly, to expand the USMCA with willing and able countries in Latin America who have proven themselves able to take on the higher obligations of the USMCA, countries like Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic. That's how you compete effectively. And number three, I think, if you go back to what I was saying about trying to gain hearts and minds, that if we look, you can disagree with this, but my contention is, based on not insignificant experience, that the United States is the preferred partner, at least compared to China, with most of Latin America and the Caribbean. If you take that as accurate, then the natural bias is toward the United States. But when you take away what makes the United States an attractive partner, consistency, support for democratic governance, relative benign support for, engagement, things like that. If you reverse it and become a threatening party or a party that is at least untrustworthy, then countries begin to hedge their bets. And what they do is they try to build those partnerships away from the United States. So look, if we solve this problem, and I imagine we will because we don't have much of a choice, if we solve this problem with Canada, I'm going to stick with Canada because it's the most self-evident issue, right, that we should not be having a war with. If we solve this issue with Canada, the Canadians are never going to go back to what they were on January 19th, 2025, a fully trusting country that says, okay, we'll sign this agreement with you and we'll expect you to abide by it and we'll determine our future based on that. No, they'll do that for the most part, but they will also hedge. And we're seeing that hedging going on right now in terms of changing economic relationships, changing political relationships, changing rhetoric, and finding ways, and these are our best friends. We're not talking Venezuela here, folks. We're talking Canada. And so this is and as a demonstration effect, other countries are saying, if that's how you treat your very best friends, how are you going to treat me? And that demonstration effect, I think, particularly in the Latin America context, and I didn't go into it because we had two fantastic historians here who did in terms of history and relationships and all that, but that's like throwing a match into kindling in the Latin America context. Oh, there go the Americans again, right? So we have to be really careful about this. And in the political environment in Washington, nuance is not necessarily a practiced art. But here in California, we can be more explicit and we can say, look, the best way to compete with China is with our friends and allies and partners, and we should build those relationships, not try to tear them down.
Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I mean, I agree with everything you've said, but to take a slightly different angle. with regard to the question of democracy in Latin America and the U.S. attitude toward it, or just the future of Latin American democracy. And that is Latin America pays attention to what the U.S. does because the U.S. sends strong messages about, strong normative messages about what's good and bad. So for example, during the mortgage crisis in the United States, the U.S. had the choice, you allow some banks to collapse or you have to bail them out. And when Latin America faced crises, the U.S. said, you got to let things collapse, and you're going to have to rebuild these things. You're going to have structural adjustment. It's all going to be painful. Unemployment's going to shoot through the roof. Poverty's going to shoot through the roof, and but in the long run, you'll have better fundamentals. But when the U.S. faced that on its own, it did not do that because it's like, well, that's actually really terrible. And with regard to democracy, if the U.S. touts the importance of democracy, but is seen as increasingly presidentialized and less democratic, Latin American leaders are going to notice, and any sort of message about democracy is going to be seen as, well, you're not doing practicing what you preach. So that it's something that if the U.S. wants to be held up as a model, then we have to be that model. Otherwise, we definitely run the risk of seeing Latin America slide in a more authoritarian direction. And it's a country, obviously, with a strong history of centralized presidents and presidentialism and authoritarianism. So that would be my take on it.
One more question? All right, please join me in thanking our panelists. This was great.